I grew up in the Midwest, surrounded by endless flat plains and dense patches of forest. My name is Ethan, and I've always considered myself a grounded person, practical, logical, and never one to give in to flights of fancy. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, so my life revolves around precision and cold, hard facts. Ghost stories, campfire tales, and supernatural nonsense were never my thing. I didn't believe in anything I couldn't measure, calculate, or see with my own two eyes. That was true, at least, until the night I spent in Black Hollow Woods. The woods had always been a shadowy enigma in our small town. They stretched for miles, a sprawling expanse of trees so tightly packed that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. Even during the day, it seemed darker in there than it had any right to be. Locals told tales of people wandering in and never coming out, of strange lights flickering in the distance, and of whispers on the wind when no one else was around. I always brushed it off as small-town superstition, the kind of stories people cling to for a little excitement in an otherwise uneventful life. My skepticism came to an abrupt end last November. It was a bitterly cold Friday night, and I'd just finished a particularly grueling week at work. My boss had dumped a stack of last-minute projects on my desk, and I'd worked late every night to meet the deadline. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was exhausted and in desperate need of an escape. So, when my buddy Trevor called and suggested a weekend camping trip, I jumped at the chance. He mentioned Black Hollow Woods, but I shrugged it off. It was just a forest, I thought. Trees, dirt, and maybe a few raccoons. Nothing to be afraid of. We packed light, a tent, some snacks, a couple of flashlights, and the kind of cheap beer you buy in bulk. Trevor and I had been friends since high school, and though we didn't see each other as often as we used to, we could always pick up where we left off. By the time we reached the edge of the woods, the sun was already setting, casting the trees in long, skeletal shadows. The air felt colder here, sharper somehow, but I chalked it up to the wind cutting through the trees. "You sure about this?" Trevor asked, glancing at me as we unloaded our gear. "Why not?" I replied, feigning confidence. "It's just a bunch of trees." Trevor hesitated for a moment before nodding. He was the superstitious type, always spooked by things that went bump in the night. I'd teased him about it for years, but now, standing on the threshold of Black Hollow Woods, I could see why he'd been reluctant. We hiked in about a mile before setting up camp in a small clearing. The canopy above was so thick that the stars were barely visible, and the only light came from the flickering flames of our campfire. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing as the night deepened. Trevor brought up the local legends, of course, regaling me with tales of shadowy figures and ghostly apparitions. I rolled my eyes and took another swig of beer, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet, as if the usual chorus of crickets and owls had been silenced. Around midnight, Trevor decided to call it a night. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the fire and letting my thoughts wander. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere deep in the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't have the erratic pattern of leaves stirring. It was deliberate, purposeful, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. "Trevor?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. My heart was pounding now, an irrational fear creeping up my spine. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, or maybe a coyote. But as the minutes ticked by, the rustling grew louder, closer. Trevor, if this is some kind of prank, it's not funny, I said, my voice trembling. Still, nothing. The firelight cast eerie dancing shadows across the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd never felt anything like it before, a primal, gut-wrenching terror that made my skin crawl. Swallowing my fear, I decided to wake Trevor, but when I turned toward the tent, I froze. The tent was empty. Trevor's sleeping bag was unzipped, his boots missing. Panic set in as I called his name over and over, my voice echoing through the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and started searching, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The rustling sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I don't know how long I wandered, but eventually I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of a small clearing, the ground was disturbed, the dirt churned up as if something had been dragged, and there, half buried in the loose soil, was Trevor's flashlight. The lens was cracked, and the light flickered weakly, casting an otherworldly glow on the surrounding trees. "Trevor!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. But the only response was the faint whisper of the wind. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I noticed something else. The trees around the clearing weren't natural. Their trunks were twisted and gnarled, the bark blackened as if burned, and etched into the surface of each tree were strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen. They seemed to pulse and writhe in the flickering light, as if alive. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My flashlight sputtered and died, plunging me into darkness. I backed away, my hands trembling, and tripped over a root. As I scrambled to my feet, I felt something cold and slimy brush against my arm. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. Branches clawed at my face and arms, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I could hear something behind me, crashing through the underbrush, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the open field, I collapsed, gasping for air. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my legs felt like jelly. I looked back at the tree line, half expecting to see something emerge, but there was nothing. Just the dark, impenetrable wall of Black Hollow Woods. Trevor was never found. The police conducted a search, but they didn't find any trace of him beyond the clearing where I'd discovered his flashlight. They questioned me extensively, and though I told them everything I'd seen, I could tell they didn't believe me. I can't say I blame them. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. I haven't been back to Black Hollow Woods since that night, and I've done my best to put it behind me. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that guttural growl echoing in the distance. And when I close my eyes, I see those twisted trees, their blackened trunks etched with symbols I can't unsee. I don't know what happened to Trevor, and I'm not sure I want to. But one thing is certain. There's something in those woods, something that defies logic and reason. And whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting. My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old, and I've always been the kind of person who takes pride in my independence. Growing up as the eldest of 3 siblings, I learned how to handle things on my own early in life. My parents weren't always around. Dad worked long shifts at the factory, and Mom was a nurse who often pulled doubles, so it fell to me to keep the household running. As a result, I've always felt confident in my ability to manage situations, to solve problems, to stay calm under pressure. That confidence led me to pursue a career in journalism. I've worked my way up to being a freelance investigative reporter, taking on assignments that other people might shy away from. I've covered protests, exposed corruption, and even embedded with first responders during a wildfire. I've seen the worst sides of humanity, but I always believed that as long as I kept my wits about me, I'd be fine. That belief was shattered one October night when I ventured into Red Gorge National Forest to work on a story. Red Gorge is one of those places that feels untouched by time. Located deep in the Pacific Northwest, it's a vast wilderness of towering pines, moss-covered boulders, and misty, winding trails. It's also notorious for its isolation. The park spans hundreds of miles, and cell service is practically non-existent. Hikers and campers are warned to stick to marked trails and always let someone know their plans before heading out. Despite this, people occasionally go missing. Most are found within a few days, but there are cases, rare, unsettling cases, where no trace is ever discovered. I wasn't there for the scenery. A series of recent disappearances had caught my attention. 5 people had vanished in the past 6 months, all in or near Red Gorge. The authorities claimed it was a coincidence, citing the dangers of wilderness exploration, unpredictable weather, wild animals, and poor navigation. But the locals told a different story. Rumors circulated about a shadowy figure seen near the trails, someone who didn't belong. I'd heard enough to know there was a story here, and I was determined to find it. I arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon, armed with my camera, voice recorder, and a backpack full of supplies. I'd done my research, studying the park's layout and pinpointing the areas where the disappearances had occurred. My plan was to camp overnight and explore the trails the following morning. The ranger station at the park's entrance was deserted when I arrived, so I left a note on my dashboard with my intended route and set off. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I found a suitable spot to set up camp just before dusk, a small clearing with enough open space to feel safe. After pitching my tent and starting a small fire, I sat down to review my notes. The cases shared an eerie pattern. All the victims had been solo hikers. All had vanished without leaving behind any sign of struggle or injury. It was as if they'd simply stepped off the trail and disappeared into thin air. As the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was paranoia, the product of too many late nights reading about the missing hikers. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, my heart racing at the slightest sound. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. My eyes shot open, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. The forest was pitch black, the moonlight barely filtering through the canopy. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, the distinct crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound assertive. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking, and pointed it toward the trees. The beam illuminated nothing but branches and shadows. "I'm armed," I lied, hoping to scare off whoever or whatever was out there. "You need to leave." No response. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight's beam darting back and forth. Finally, the footsteps resumed, retreating this time, fading into the distance. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting upright in my tent with a makeshift weapon, a heavy branch I'd grabbed from the ground, clutched in my hands. When dawn finally broke, I packed up camp and set off, determined to get to the bottom of what had happened. I followed the trail to the area where the most recent disappearance had occurred, a narrow path that led to a steep ravine. The forest felt different here, heavier somehow. The air was colder, the trees more tightly packed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I approached the ravine, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed, as if someone had been digging. I crouched down to examine it and realized it wasn't a single hole, but a series of shallow graves. My stomach turned as I uncovered a fragment of fabric, dirty and torn, sticking out of the soil. It matched the description of a shirt worn by one of the missing hikers. Before I could process what I'd found, I heard the footsteps again. They were faster this time, more purposeful. I barely had time to react before a figure emerged from the trees, a man dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a hood. He was carrying something long and metallic, a hunting knife. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Panic set in as I scrambled to my feet. "I'm leaving," I said, backing away slowly. "I didn't see anything." He took a step closer, raising the knife. Too late for that. Adrenaline kicked in, and I turned and ran, my lungs burning as I tore through the forest. The man's footsteps thundered behind me, gaining with every step. I didn't dare look back, focusing instead on the trail ahead. The terrain was treacherous, roots and rocks threatening to trip me up at every turn. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I spotted a ranger station in the distance. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The station was empty, but it had a radio. My hands shook as I fumbled with the dials, finally managing to call for help. When the rangers arrived, the man was gone. They found evidence of his presence, footprints, the disturbed graves, but no sign of him. The police launched an investigation, but as far as I know, he's still out there. I haven't been back to Red Gorge since that day. The story I published led to increased safety measures in the park, but it's small comfort. I still have nightmares about that night, about the man in the woods and the sound of his footsteps chasing me. And every so often, when I'm walking alone, I'll hear a twig snap, and feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and I'll wonder if he's found me again. I've always craved solitude. Maybe it's because I work as a writer, constantly juggling deadlines and the noise of the city. Phones ringing, car horns blaring, people talking over each other. It all piles up until the only thing I want is silence. Real silence. The kind you only find in nature, far from the chaos of daily life. My name is Sarah, and a few months ago, after wrapping up a particularly grueling project, I decided I needed a break. Not a quick weekend at a coffee shop or a trip to a bustling resort, but a real escape. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere remote. That's how I ended up choosing the Tonto National Forest in Arizona. It's a sprawling place, known for its rugged beauty and trails that cut deep into untouched wilderness. A friend once told me about it, describing it as a sanctuary for anyone seeking solitude. That's exactly what I needed. I planned a day hike on a trail called the Lost Ridge Loop. It was a 6-mile circuit that promised scenic views, moderate difficulty, and most importantly, the kind of isolation I craved. I'm not an expert hiker, but I'm not clueless either. I'd done a few trails near home and knew the basics. Bring water, pack a map, and always stick to the trail. The Lost Ridge Loop seemed manageable. I checked the weather forecast the night before, packed my backpack with essentials, water, snacks, compass, and map, and drove out early the next morning. The drive was peaceful. The sun rose behind me, casting long shadows over the desert landscape. By the time I reached the trailhead around 8:30 a.m., the air was cool, with just a faint breeze rustling through the trees. I was alone. There were no other cars in the small dirt parking lot. Perfect. The trail started off as a well-defined path winding gently through tall pines and low shrubs. The morning light filtered through the branches, painting everything in shades of gold and green. I felt my shoulders relax as the tension of city life melted away. This was exactly what I needed. About an hour in, I noticed the trail growing narrower. The trees pressed closer together, their branches tangling overhead and blocking out much of the sunlight. The temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew still. I brushed it off as a natural part of hiking deeper into the forest. After all, trails change. That's part of their charm. But something about this change felt different. Subtle at first. A faint unease crept in, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The quiet seemed too complete, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Even the birds had stopped chirping. I stopped to check my map. According to it, I was still on track. The loop should start curving back toward the trailhead in another couple of miles. Still, the nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't leave me. I decided to keep going, reminding myself that nerves can play tricks on you when you're alone in unfamiliar surroundings. And then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like someone speaking just beyond the trees to my left. I froze, my pulse quickening. The voice wasn't loud, nor did it sound distressed. It was steady, almost conversational, though I couldn't make out the words. My first thought was that it must be another hiker, but I hadn't seen anyone all morning, and the trail was too remote for casual visitors. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The sound echoed briefly before fading into the stillness. The voice stopped. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I waited, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had carried a sound from farther away, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Either way, standing still wasn't going to help. I adjusted my pack and kept walking, trying to shake the growing unease. After another 20 minutes, I came across a clearing. At its center stood a small cabin, weathered and old, with its roof sagging and its wooden walls faded to a dull gray. It wasn't marked on my map. There shouldn't have been anything out here. No campsites, no structures, nothing. My curiosity warred with my instincts. On one hand, I wanted to know what the cabin was doing here. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Still, I approached cautiously, my boots crunching softly on the dirt. As I neared the door, I noticed something in the dirt outside it. A footprint. Fresh. The edges were sharp, the impression deep, as if someone had been standing there recently. My heart hammered in my chest. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I glanced at the cabin. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. The windows were dark, offering no hint of what lay inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on that door. And then I heard it again. The voice. This time it was closer, coming from behind the cabin. It was low, almost a murmur, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. Panic surged through me. I stepped back, my mind racing. Should I call out again? Should I run? Before I could decide, a figure stepped out from behind the cabin. It was a man. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hair unkempt, his face gaunt. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there watching me. I didn't mean to intrude, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I was just hiking. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then he took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees and back toward the trail. My lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves behind me sent fresh waves of terror coursing through me. I didn't know if he was following, but I wasn't going to stop to find out. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the trailhead. My car was still there, the side of it a lifeline. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and threw myself into the driver's seat. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was nothing. Just the trees, silent and unmoving. I haven't been back to the Tonto National Forest since that day. Sometimes I try to convince myself that I overreacted, that the man was just a harmless hermit or a fellow hiker. But deep down, I know better. There was something about the way he looked at me, something that told me I had come too close to a place I wasn't meant to find. And I'll never go back.